Most everything I'm sharing with you today is not my information. It's information that I have been studying. So the content, the concepts, and the science have been acquired from medical doctors, a couple of PhDs, but all of them are coming from a perspective of having used the keto diet, practiced the keto diet, and have benefited from the keto diet. So it's not theory, it's practice. My background is that I have an undergraduate degree from the University of Southern Mississippi. I played tennis there as a scholarship athlete many years ago. I've taught at different levels from the elementary up through the college level, and I've started 2 small home-based businesses. I'm also a wife, a mother, and an auntie. These are some of the resources that I wanted to put in a slide. Under the doctor list is Dr. Robert Sivas. He is a medical doctor. He's a bariatric surgeon, and he's also my personal telehealth doctor, because when you go in this direction of eating, it's really hard to find a doctor that understands what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then when you get your blood work done, they're not really even sure how to interpret your blood work. So it's really important that if you do this, you have, a doctor that you're working with, and you do get blood work done on a regular basis just to reinforce that what you're doing is actually helping you. But anyway, his PhD is on the liver. So he's kind of a unique individual, because the liver is really where a lot of the metabolic action takes place when we're synthesizing for food and for nutrition and for energy. A lot of times when people go keto, they don't know how to cook or what to make. So I thought I would include some people that I know are really practical and helpful with helping you prepare your keto meals. The third one down, they call themselves the Keto Twins, and they are outstanding. And they've struggled the exact same way. They look exactly, their weight is almost exact as well as their appearance. When they eat keto, they eat what's called a dirty keto. It's kind of a laid-back, relaxed approach to the ketogenic diet. At the top on the right-hand side, there are people who eat no carbohydrates, and they're called zero carbohydrate or carnivores. Again, I like to follow doctors, so Dr. Sean Baker, Dr. Paul Saladino. Anyone heard of Michaela Peterson? Okay, she's Jordan Peterson's daughter. If you don't do anything else with this presentation, I really recommend that you seek out information on Michaela Peterson. She has just got a fascinating story. She had so many autoimmune illnesses that she was literally diagnosed with idiopathic arthritis when she was a toddler, because she couldn't crawl. She was unable to crawl, so therefore she was unable to walk. And instead of going a nutritional route to try to figure out what her problem was, they went the medical route. And so by the time she was in high school, she was on an inordinate amount of medicines that, she didn't really want to be on. By the time she got in college, she had to have one of her ankles replaced and one of her hips replaced because of the arthritis. And then, so through a series of events, she discovered that she has an autoimmune condition. And then she was able to really work at eliminating those foods in her nutrition that were causing an autoimmune response. And she was able to get off of all her medication. And it's just a really wonderful story. Why am I interested in helping others with their nutritional health? I think primarily it's because I'm 64 years old. So I've been on this planet for a little over 6 decades. And I feel like I have seen a phenomena that should not be. I have just seen people get so sick. I've seen an increase in rare types of diseases and illnesses that you never heard of when I was younger, or even as a young adult. I mean, they just didn't exist. You didn't know the names of them because you rarely ever saw them. And I all through my adult life, I thought, what's going on? This is weird. Why are people so allergic to this type of food, and seasonal allergies and autoimmune this and that? And I really had, I had no answers to any of that. And then along with that, I've also noticed, and I'm sure you have too, I'm sure that you can relate to this, many of you, this whole cottage industry of pharmaceuticals. You can't watch cable TV anymore without being bombarded with advertisements for medicine. And some of these medicines have the most strangest names because they have to copyright it, so it can't sound like any other name that's already out there. And it's just like there's so much money being made off of medicines, so it's being made off the backs of sick people. And that's just not right. There's something really wrong. And I think we all kind of sense it, but we don't can't quite put our finger on it. I want to be real careful with how I word this because I would not ever want to offend anyone. But over the course of my life, I have just seen people gain so much weight, and it's everywhere. And it's not just adults, it's children. The kind of weight gain that we're seeing is not healthy. And it's putting us all at risk. So I've kind of been on a search for answers, and I feel like, you have to be careful when you feel like you've discovered the fountain of youth, but I really feel like I have discovered some truth and some answers to some of the dilemma that I have been observing, and so I really am eager to share that with you today. Before we get started, I suggest that what Mark Twain once said is going to apply this morning. Mark Twain, he's got some really wonderful expressions, and so he once said, that just ain't so. And so let's talk a little bit about that today. The things that we know that just ain't so. Okay, so what is keto? I don't know exactly in the room who all knows what about keto. It's kind of been around for a while, so it's not like a totally new concept. But keto is short for ketogenic, okay? And it refers to the body's ability to burn ketones. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Keto was first used in the 1920s to successfully treat seizures resulting from epilepsy. Unfortunately, as medicines became more developed, they've now replaced what epileptics used to do nutritionally. They've replaced it with medicines. So that's a good thing in some way, but it might be better if they could control it through their diet. Keto utilizes the biological science of macronutrient-based metabolism. In summary, keto is a weight and health optimization diet. So it's so much more than just losing weight. So here's a picture of the two pyramids that we're going to be contrasting and comparing, two food groups. The one on the left is your keto food pyramid, and the one on the right is your standard American diet. Now, the government doesn't really recommend pyramids anymore. I think they have a My Plate. So it went from like the pyramid to My Pyramid and then something else and then My Plate. But we're going to use the pyramids because it's just a good way to kind of compare and contrast the differences. Let's look at the keto food pyramid. The largest segment of the pyramid is at the bottom in both. And for the keto diet, eggs, dairy, meat, and oils are what you want to primarily focus on, okay? Now, it's a shame that this pyramid didn't include fats. So what really should be in there are animal fats, such as tallow, suet, and lard. We used to use lard all the time to cook with. Unfortunately, that's been replaced with vegetable oils, but we need to go back to that, and we're going to talk about that. The oils in the pyramid there are primarily referring to fruit oil. So fruit oil would be avocado, coconut, and olive, okay? But it also includes, as I said, fats that come from animals. In the keto diet, you eat non-starchy vegetables. So those are vegetables like asparagus, artichoke, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, cucumber, mushrooms. And you can also eat other vegetables, but you just want to count the grams of carbohydrates so that you keep your grams of carbohydrates under a certain number. And we're going to talk more about that. This is kind of just an overview to kind of get us started. At the very top, you have a very small amount of nuts and seeds and berries. Okay, so nuts and seeds are high in fat, which is good because it's a high-fat, low-carb diet, but they're also high in carbohydrates. And they're very hard to limit. When you start eating nuts, you just want to keep eating them and eating them. So they're hard to, but you want to keep them limited. And then really the only fruit at the top of the pyramid there, you see berries. That's really the only fruit that keto diet recommends. And that's pure and simple because of the sugar. And fruit, especially today, has been so altered that it's really like eating sugar bombs. We're going to talk a little bit more about that too. But really and truly, we don't realize it, but because we live in a modern age, but our forefathers and foremothers ate this way. This is how they ate. they didn't have access to all the different varieties and supplements and everything that we have access to. So it's really not a new diet. It's a time-tested diet. It's a proven diet that we have kind of strayed away from, and with really unfortunate consequences. So just at the very bottom there, it says Keto Way of Eating, WOE, Way of Eating. This is Dr. Eric Westman's keto protocol, and this doctor treats people who are obese and helps them lose weight. He has a clinic in Raleigh, North Carolina at Duke University School of Medicine, and this is his protocol. 20 grams or less of carbs daily. This is to lose weight, okay? Non-starchy vegetables, fatty meat, lamb, fish, and poultry. Limited dairy, and I would recommend that you really want to make sure you're eating raw dairy and not pasteurized dairy, and I know that's hard, but pasteurized dairy, it can create more problems than it can solve. No sugar, natural or added, none. No vegetable oils at all. Fruit oils, yes, but no vegetable oils. No bread, no corn, no beans, and no rice. The food foundation for this diet is really what we've been eating for millennia before the modern age. And that would be basically beef, butter, bacon, and eggs. And when I say beef, I mean lamb, pork, poultry, all of the animal meats that you can eat, beef, butter, and all the fat that comes from animal products. And then bacon is not taboo, even though we've been told it is. And then, so beef, butter, bacon, and eggs. And eggs are one of the highest, most nutrient-dense single food that we can actually eat, despite the fact that we've been told for generations not to eat eggs. So today's presentation is going to be kind of a clash of worldviews, so be forewarned. You can't say I didn't warn you. Trigger warning. So this picture of the steak and the blue cheese on top and the asparagus is like the perfect meal if you're on keto. It has everything you need. And we're going to talk about why that is, but it has everything you need, and it's very simple. It's not complicated. You have the non-starchy vegetable on the side, your asparagus. This is probably a ribeye, so it has protein and it has fat and a little bit of dairy on the top. Versus the standard American diet, which is full of highly refined processed carbohydrates. Highly refined processed carbohydrates. Now, those are two extremes. Not everybody either eats one or the other, and I understand that, but it does kind of simplify the difference. And the next two images that I'm going to show you are the best way that I have heard. This is not original with me, but it's the best way I have heard to compare the standard American diet and the ketogenic diet. The first picture is of a campfire, which has a good burn, but it's going to die out quickly. And you can see that it's burning primarily because it has twigs and kindling. And so the source of energy is not going to sustain the fire. And in order for the fire to continue to burn, more kindling will need to be added. And so this is like the human body on the standard American diet, because we're told primarily to eat carbohydrates. Remember that food pyramid down at the bottom. On the standard American diet side, it was primarily pasta, rice, breads, and beans and legumes, and all of those types of foods that produce glucose for energy. Unfortunately, when the body has to produce energy from carbohydrates, that creates, it sets the body up for a whole host of complications that result in the types of problems that we see today that I was mentioning earlier. So you have all this insulin now that's required to metabolize the sugar, and the insulin is a storage hormone. It's a fat storage hormone, and that's why we have so much excess fat on our body, is because we're eating so many carbohydrates, and our body insulin now has to figure out what to do with it, so it stores it as fat. And too much insulin also creates a domino cascade of health issues, starting with insulin resistance, which is what results in prediabetes and diabetes. And and ends in a whole cascade of other types of problems. So the next image is the human body on ketones. So the body is either going to burn glucose from carbohydrates, or it's going to burn ketones from fat and protein. So those two images pretty much sum up the difference between the standard American diet and the ketogenic diet. This huge log burning fire is our body on ketones. Ketones are the byproduct of burning fat for fuel. Okay? This is known as ketosis. And so that's what you're shooting for, is to get your body into a state of ketosis. Now, you want to be careful that you don't confuse, like you were talking about with someone who has diabetes who might be afraid to do this diet. It's kind of understandable why they might think this, because there's a really harmful condition called ketoacidosis. You all heard of that? Anybody? So ketoacidosis is what you get into when you're diabetic and your blood sugars are just off the chart. Okay, and then you have way too many ketones in your body. That's different than ketosis. So it is understandable. It's a little confusing because of that. But people with ketoacidosis are almost always on the standard American diet. So that's part of the problem, if not all of the problem. So here are some pictures of people who didn't live too long ago, but they look quite different, wouldn't you say? So this is a picture of some children running to the water in the 1940s. You can see these little boys' ribs. Well, that's how everybody looked. Everybody looked like that. And of course, if you saw that today, you'd think, oh my gosh, that little child is undernourished, But it's not true. They were healthy. They were happy. They weren't on medications. And then in the 1950s, some ladies here standing, that was how we looked. In the 1960s, that happens to be a picture of my oldest brother who was an athlete. Look how skinny he is. To me, it looks skinny, But back then, we all looked like that. And so if you were an athlete, if you were like a wrestler or a football player, you probably were a little bit heavier. But so we haven't realized it as much, but our body types have changed so much, and our children are growing up in a time when their body types are also very different, meaning more weight than they really should have on their bodies. Whether or not we're willing to face it or not, we have a modern health crisis on our hands. And these are the broad categories of what I'm talking about here. One of the great many ways and ways in which things have changed in the last 70, 75 years are all the autoimmune diseases and other contemporary modern illnesses. We don't realize it, but these are modern illnesses. A lot of these illnesses that we hear about or have ourselves, these are all relatively new. We now have over 100 autoimmune illnesses, probably much more than that. Rheumatoid arthritis, celiac disease, Crohn's, fibromyalgia, thyroid dysfunction, I have that, irritable bowel syndrome, lupus, chronic Lyme disease, multiple sclerosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, prediabetes and diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is one of the fastest growing diseases for children 5 years old. 5 years old, 6 years old, 7 years old. It used to be that type 2 diabetes was only for old people. You would be in your 60s and your 70s before you ever got type 2 diabetes. So the other fastest growing disease among little children is fatty liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver. And it used to be that you only saw someone with fatty liver who was, unfortunately struggling with alcohol, and they were an alcoholic and they would get fatty liver. Now children are getting non-alcoholic fatty liver. So there's got to be a reason for this, and we can't just stick our heads in the ground. We've got to take a look at this, because if we don't, it's going to be to our own demise. And then again, just the issues with weight, overweight, and morbid obesity. You never saw anybody obese. Now we have morbid obesity, and it's chronic. But it's up to us. It's my responsibility to take care of my body. and it's your responsibility to take care of yours. You know, it's nobody else's job. It's not the medical profession. It's not some expert somewhere. It's not somebody who's going to sweep in our life and just do it for us, you know, and make it all happen. It doesn't work that way. But we can take, you know, responsibility for our health. It doesn't mean that we don't need the medical profession. It doesn't mean that we don't need medicines. I'm not suggesting that. But I think you get the point. We are the ones that drive the car as far as our health is concerned. Okay, so first things first. Before we get too far into the nuts and bolts of keto, but this is really a part of keto as well, we really need to spend a quick minute laying a basic nutritional foundation. So let's talk about why we need to eat in the first place. I didn't really know 4 years ago when I started keto why I needed to eat other than I was hungry and it tasted good and I liked it, you know. But there really are only two reasons why we need to eat. The first one is we eat for nutrition or nutrients. And the second is we eat for energy. That's it. We don't eat for the rainbow, the color of the rainbow, or any of that stuff. We eat for nutrition and we eat for energy, and that's all. And all of our nutrition and our energy comes from either plants or animals. So you have two broad categories, okay? And all plants and animal foods make up what are known as macronutrients. So macronutrients is something you really have to learn if you're going to do keto. But remember, there's only 3, so it's not that hard. But this is in part why people have a hard time explaining what keto is, because most people don't have even a basic understanding of nutrition, like I didn't 4 years ago. So as I say, the great news is that there are only 3 macronutrients. And those macros, we'll call them macros for short, are fat, carbs, and protein. So that's it. We have fats, we have carbohydrates, and we have proteins. And now we just need to really invest ourselves into learning what they are and what they accomplish and why we need to know about them. So your fats that you eat are metabolized into fatty acids. Okay, your body uses fatty acids. The protein gets metabolized into amino acids. And so those top 2 are really, really important. You have different types of fats. You have unsaturated, saturated, trans fats, which are not healthy. You do have some trans fats in your body that your body actually makes, but you never want to eat any dietary trans fat. And from fat, we get energy and fuel. So protein, of course, I'm going to only include animal protein. I'm not going to include any plant protein like soybean protein or pea protein because I see that as inferior. And it's not bioavailable. Okay, so you can do your plant protein, that's fine. Just know that it's an incomplete protein. Like, you know, when you have beans, you have to have rice, and then there's a conversion process that your body has to perform in order to get a complete amino acid. So it's not as bioavailable as if you ate that ribeye steak that was up on the screen. You eat that, the body loves it. It absorbs all the nutrition and all the fat. There's no conversion process that needs to take place. So that's why I'm not going to include it. And protein is what our body is made up of protein, basically. We're walking around protein bags, basically. So we need protein, and the protein that we eat, the dietary protein that we eat, is the building blocks for the body. Your carbohydrates are, and when I started 4 years ago, I didn't know all my carbohydrates. I mean, I had this kind of vague general idea, but I didn't know fruits were carbohydrates. I didn't know that a fruit was a carbohydrate. I didn't know that coffee was a carbohydrate. I just know I like to drink it, you know. So carbohydrates are grains, seeds, nuts, vegetables, fruit, beans, legumes, and all the processed foods made from them. So all your refined processed food is going to come from carbohydrates. You might have a little dairy in a candy bar or a dairy here and there, but it's primarily going to be from the world of carbohydrates. And if you notice, there are 2 macros that provide energy or fuel, and they are fat and carbohydrates. So you can get your energy from either fat or carbohydrates. So the standard American diet, if you'll notice, I have underlined carbohydrates. The standard American diet in that diet, you're consuming between 45 and 65% of your calories in carbohydrates. In the keto diet, which is low carb, high fat, I'm using what Diet Doctor recommends. There's all different kinds of people that say you should eat keto this way. No, you should eat keto this way. No, you should count your macros, and you have to have an app on your phone to tell you what your macro count is. I've never done that, and I don't ascribe to that. I think that's too overwhelming, and I don't think it's even necessary. So this is just a general way to kind of break down a liberal amount of grams carbohydrates, a moderate amount, and a strict amount. If you want to lose weight, you have to have a more strict amount in order to lose the weight. And then if you want to keep the weight off, you pretty much have to continue eating that way. One of the failures of the Atkins diet that I have read is that the Atkins diet was a low carb diet, and most of you are probably very familiar with it. But the problem with the success rate there is people would go on Atkins, they'd lose their weight, and then they'd go off Atkins and reintroduce all the foods that they were eating before. And of course, they're just going to put the weight back on. And then it would be said, Atkins doesn't work, or I tried Atkins or whatever. Well, the same thing is true with keto. And so that element is there if you're trying to lose weight. But the good news is that when you eat this way, if you eat this way the way you should eat this way, you are so fulfilled and so satisfied, and you don't crave carbohydrates. You get your body into a place where you're burning ketones like that log fire that we were looking at, and you're just humming along in life. You don't even really think about food. Think about that. Going through life not thinking about food, because your body is operating at peak performance. And that's what I've experienced. And that's why I'm standing up here, because most of the time you can ask my husband, I can run circles around him. That's not really true. But I really am operating at peak performance. So, gosh, why wouldn't I want to keep eating this way? Most people consume, on the standard American diet, we're consuming between 200 and 300 grams of carbohydrates. That's a lot, a whole lot. All right, so keto has been used to treat individuals with epileptic seizures. Keto results in insulin sensitivity, not insulin resistance, which leads to diabetes. The keto model is a healthy, high-fat, low-carbohydrate model. Keto metabolism burns ketones, not glucose, for energy. Keto can provide substantial, lasting health benefits. Keto approach is not a calorie counting model. It's a carbohydrate counting model. And keto aids in weight loss and management. Some of the ways in which keto can specifically address current modern day illnesses are listed here. There are 11 of them that are listed there. The one that I want to talk about, because I don't want to go through all of these, but the one that I want to talk about is brain health, number 8. I don't know if you realize it or not, but today, many in the medical profession, even the establishment medical profession, are now calling Alzheimer's diabetes type 3. Have you heard that? Some of you have heard that. So it's a diabetic condition of the brain where the brain is insulin resistant because there's been so much sugar that's been sent to the brain, and it says, no, I don't want any more, don't give me any more. And the insulin just stops being sent to the brain, and then you have all kinds of serious dementia and other types of problems. So, and I would be willing to bet that our forefathers and foremothers didn't see near the rate of dementia that we have today, much less Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's was never even talked about when I was a child. I never heard the word Alzheimer's till I was well into my adulthood. Again, I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that. So now we're going to focus on carbohydrates. I don't want to demonize carbohydrates because God gave us carbohydrates. The Bible is full of examples, and we've been eating carbohydrates ever since the beginning of time. But we need to talk about carbohydrates. So we're going to do that now. What are carbohydrates? They are all your plants. They're your grains, your seeds, your nuts, your vegetables, your legumes, beans, fruits, processed food made from them. What does our body metabolize or convert carbohydrates into? Always converts it into sugar. Always, okay? Or when it gets into your body, it's referred to as glucose, but it's blood sugar. What are the daily dietary requirements for carbohydrates? Anybody know? Zero. Isn't that interesting? We're talking about fruits and vegetables, and there's zero essential carbohydrates. Not only are there no daily dietary requirements, there are no weekly dietary requirements, there are no hourly dietary requirements. You don't ever have to eat them. I spent my whole life trying to eat a balanced diet of fruits and vegetables and a little bit of meat on the side, a little bit of chicken on the side. What is up with this? Makes me think of that Mark Twain quote. All right, this next image is, I find this fascinating. And when I first discovered this, I just was blown away. So it's not only that we don't have to eat carbohydrates, but it's today's carbohydrates have been so altered. Can anybody guess what that first picture is on the top left-hand corner? It's a banana. That's a banana. That is a true banana. What we have today is a fake banana, basically. The banana originally was super fibrous. It had seeds the size of raisins. And if you were to eat a banana, you'd have to boil it first in order to eat it. Did you already know that? Yeah. So I was blown away when I had seen bananas change. You know, I remember when there were seeds in bananas. Y'all remember, some of you who are my age, and then progressively there were no seeds. Now you eat a banana and you don't even really see the tiny little remnants of seeds. Of course, they can't be reproduced either. They have to keep, they've been so altered that there are no seeds to reproduce them. Okay, below that you have the wheat, an example of how a wheat has been changed. What I've read is that the wheat used to be about like here. Now wheat is here because we have hybridized it. We've been able to, alter it. And the higher the wheat, the more wheat production and the more you can make flour and all the different things. But what happens is that, so now I know why people have gluten intolerances. And that was another thing. I was like, what in the world? You can't eat bread? Why can't you eat bread? We've been eating bread for ages. Well, the reason people are having trouble with gluten is because there's too much of it. And our body cannot digest. A lot of people cannot digest gluten. And when it was the original wheat, there was not too much gluten and you could digest it. But because we have hybridized wheat the way we have, there's just too much gluten in it. And what gluten does is it gets into your intestinal tract, and some people cannot digest it, and then it triggers an autoimmune defense mechanism, and then you get all kinds of irritable bowel problems and that's why people have celiac disease. In the middle is a progression of corn. The original corn looked like the small picture on the left-hand side, and now it looks like the big modern corn, which is loaded with sugar. On the right-hand side is a watermelon. That is the original watermelon. It was, again, very fibrous, very hard to eat, and very little sugar content. And also seeds. So when you ate a watermelon, you were digging around the fiber and the seeds just to get a little bit of sweet flavoring. Anybody can guess? Can anyone guess what the picture on the bottom right-hand corner is?
Carrot?
Yes, who said that? That is a carrot. Now, granted, that's probably an extreme example of what carrots used to look like, but it's a carrot. So we don't realize this, but what we're eating today is very different than what our forefathers and foremothers would have eaten. So on the keto diet, you're going to count carbohydrates. You're not going to count calories unless you just want to. You can, but it's not necessary. And just a reminder of why we want to limit our carbohydrates is because we want to limit the blood sugar in our bodies, because too much blood sugar creates too much insulin, and insulin, there's nothing wrong with insulin, but too much insulin can wreak havoc on our bodies. And too much insulin can result in insulin resistance, hyperinsulinemia, and this raises one's risk of obesity, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and a host of other. So sugar consumption, as we know, most of us already know that it's been rising steadily for a great while. And if you look at this on the far left-hand side, in the 1700s, the average person consumed about 4 pounds of sugar a year. Okay. By the 1800s, the average person consumed about 18 pounds of sugar a year. By the 1900s, individual sugar consumption had risen to 90 pounds per year. And in 2009, which is still some time ago, more than 50% Americans consumed a half a pound of sugar per day, which is 180 pounds of sugar per year. And we don't even realize we're doing this because so much of the food that we eat has sugar in it. Like you can't go buy some condiments like a bottle of ketchup. Got sugar in it. Mustard doesn't, so that's good to know. That's a good keto condiment. Mayonnaise, it's got sugar in it. Just about everything has sugar in it. And so one of the neat things that's happened because of our government, one of the few things that's happened good because of our government is that food industry is required to put their ingredients on, label their food with the content of the ingredients. So I really encourage you going forward, if you want to be mindful of the amount of sugar you're consuming, to look at the ingredients, turn it around. And it may not say sugar, it may say corn syrup, or it may say high fructose corn syrup, it may say cane syrup, it may say agave. All of that is going to be metabolized the same way in the body. So just so you get an idea, we're talking about grams of carbohydrates, and a lot of us don't really think in terms of grams. We kind of think, inches, feet, yards. And unless you do a lot of cooking, you don't really weigh your food in grams. But so I didn't have a kitchen scale until 4 years ago when I started this. I never used a kitchen scale to weigh my food. I just followed recipes. But 1 level teaspoon of sugar is about 4 grams. That's not very much. So if you remember Dr. Westman's protocol to lose weight on the keto diet, you need to limit your carbohydrates to 20 grams or less. So that's not very many grams of carbohydrates. But the good news is because you're prioritizing protein and fat, at the same time you're limiting your carbohydrates, it's highly sustainable because protein and fat are very satiating, and it's almost impossible to overeat on ribeye steak, right? You sit down to eat a steak, you eat, and then you're eating, and then you just can't eat anymore. You reach a point where you're just totally saturated and you just push it away. I don't want to eat anymore. And you can't. So that's the good thing about protein and fat. It's very satiating. What is also really interesting about this teaspoon of sugar is that at any given time in the body, you should only have about a half a teaspoon of salt in your blood. You don't need sugar. You don't need any more than just a half a teaspoon of sugar. That's all the body wants. It doesn't want any more than that. But you can see we're putting a whole lot more than that into our body every single day. No wonder we're so sick. So, sugar is the sociopath of foods. It acts sweet, but it's really poison. Unfortunately. All right, so now we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of keto, and that has to do with our macronutrients. So the only 2 required macros are protein and fat. And this is just settled nutritional science. This is not Anne's opinion. This is not, anybody's opinion. This is settled science. Now, unfortunately, in today's world, you're not going to really hear this. You're not going to really understand this, and you probably weren't taught this in school. But the only thing we really have to eat is protein and fat. But we want to eat healthy protein and we want to eat healthy fats. So any kind of animal protein is fair game. It's all good. Don't worry about it. If it's bacon, don't worry about it. There's more nitrates and nitrites in celery than there is in bacon. So don't worry about it. Just eat it. When you get up in the morning, bacon and eggs. Slap that down in the frying pan and eat it up. And you won't be hungry for the next 3 hours. That's the other thing. If you have a bagel for breakfast and some cream cheese, which I used to do, or a bowl of cereal, I was hungry about an hour later. But if I eat my bacon and eggs in the morning or the equivalent, I'm not hungry for hours. And I haven't eaten any carbohydrate. With your fats, so the fruit oils, we don't think in terms of fruit oils, but your olive oil, your avocado oil, and your coconut oil are really fruit oils. They're high in saturated fat. They're good for you. That's slab of fat that's in the picture there, that could either be fatty bacon or it could be tallow, which would be beef fat. And then your other fats there, you learn about this. Anything but a vegetable oil, okay, is going to be pretty safe. And the next image is going to be a really marvelous food that we all have access to. It's a wonderful food that God has provided. It's been demonized, unfortunately, for many, many years. It's amazing, though. It's nutrient dense. It's energy packed. It's delicious, and it's extremely versatile. The incredible edible egg. So let's not overlook this. This is really important. Many civilizations have survived with the use of chickens and eggs. Like I said earlier, beef, butter, bacon, and eggs. And the egg is so versatile. Now, I know some people have a hard time eating eggs, but you can teach yourself how to eat eggs in increments if you're really determined. And it has almost the perfect fat to protein ratio that you want. It's a little bit higher than fat than it is in protein, just in the egg. And there are no carbohydrates in the egg. It's a great source of saturated fat and cholesterol. And saturated fat and cholesterol, unfortunately, have been demonized. But without saturated fat and without cholesterol, you're going to have a real big problem with your sex hormones. You're going to have problem thinking and concentrating. Without cholesterol and saturated fat, you're going to have a really difficult time just with your neuromuscular function. All kinds of problems happen as a result of not having enough cholesterol and saturated fat. The egg is very high in vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids. And so we were told for decades not to eat the egg. And that was bad science. That was bad science. That was wrong science. It really wasn't even science. So what we're going to do now is we're going to segue and we're going to talk about the history of food and why we are where we are today and who were the influencers that took us away from animal products, because that's basically what happened. We were told to replace animal products with carbohydrates. And I find this very fascinating because I love history. My husband loves history. At about the turn of the century, the 20th century, there were 4 primary dietary influencers. And these 4 individuals approached food from what they considered to be a biblical perspective. And as hard as it is for me to talk about this, because I am a Christian and I believe the Bible, my husband is a minister, it's true. It wasn't biblical. Their thinking wasn't biblical, but it was religious. And, we all know there's a difference. There's a difference between being a Christian and there's a difference between that and being religious. So the first person that we're going to talk about is Sylvester Stallone. I wish I could talk about him. No, Sylvester Graham. And then we're going to talk about Ellen G. White, John Harvey Kellogg, and Leonard Francis Cooper. We're also going to talk about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I'm not doing that in order to in any way be critical of any other movement, but it is a part of our history, and so we have to talk about it. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has been a strong influencer among medical missionaries and the whole teaching on vegetarianism. Aside from Sylvester Graham, he was a Presbyterian minister. The other 3 people in this slide were all Seventh-day Adventist, and they started the anti-meat bias that we now know in the United States, and we do have an anti-meat bias. Okay, the standard American diet now is a plant-based diet. It's got a little bit of protein on the side, but it's plant-based because it's primarily carbohydrates, which are grains. It's a grain-based diet. So let's first look at Reverend Graham. He believed that the Bible ordained a vegetarian diet, and he was very involved in the temperance movement. And the temperance movement was when they were trying to prohibit the drinking of alcohol, and there were a lot of problems with alcoholism. People were depressed, and they were leaving the country, and they were moving into the city, and there was a lot of uncleanness and a lot of excess drinking. And so the church kind of rose up in response to that, and it's called the temperance movement. And that was the time period in which he lived. Graham taught that human physiology was that of an herbivore, that we really should eat like a plant eater. He introduced the low-fat, high-fiber concept. He taught that meat was an unnatural food, and he discouraged the consumption of dairy and promoted whole grain bread. He was the first promoter of public health, and he didn't actually invent graham flour, but his followers did, and it was meant to be a substitute for eating meat. Next, Ellen G. White. She was the prophetess and the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ellen and her husband James taught that vegetarianism is God's original diet, and I think some of us still kind of believe that. I mean, I think it was his original diet before the fall. And they taught that the only proper diet for humanity was vegetarianism. Ellen based this on a few select scriptural passages, but she also based it on alleged visions that she received from God and alleged revelations that she received from God. And she wrote profusely about these visions, and they became a part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. One such revelation was that meat causes cancer. That was the first time that thought had ever been introduced into society. It came from Ellen G. White. And of course, now today, people still believe that you should not eat meat, that it causes cancer. This is a quote from her, and I pulled this up from the Adventist Nutrition and Dietetics International Association, so this is their material. This is what she said: "Those who use flesh meat disregard all the warnings that God has given concerning this question. They have no evidence that they are walking in safe paths. They have not the slightest excuse for eating the flesh of dead animals. God's curse is resting upon the animal creation. Many times when meat is eaten, it decays in the stomach and creates disease. Cancers, tumors, and pulmonary diseases are largely caused by eating meat." And she thought that God had revealed that information to her and that it was her responsibility and obligation to make sure that everyone knew that. And don't think for a second that this hasn't influenced the way we think about meat today, because it has. Next is John Harvey Kellogg. Remember Kellogg cornflakes? So he and his brother created cornflakes. And the reason they created cornflakes is because they wanted to provide an alternative to breakfast foods that included meat and dairy. So Kellogg was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist, and he was mentored by Ellen G. White and her husband James. They created the concept of breakfast cereals. We didn't have cereals before then. They created the actual first cereal, which was Kellogg's cornflakes. And they did so because they thought it would be a healthier alternative to eating meat. He was a vegetarian, obviously, and many attribute him as starting the very first health food industry, or he started the health food industry. He was the inventor of peanut butter and all our nut butters that came from peanut butter. So he got it going as an alternative to meat. And so he invented peanut butter, cornflakes, or what used to be called flaked corn, as a meat and dairy substitute. He also invented granola, which was originally called granula. He invented the first meatless meat from nuts called meat analogs. Today we have vegetarian burgers and better than beef, better than meat, or what are some of the names of them? Beyond burgers. Yeah. Impossible meat or Whoppers or whatever. Yeah. So we've got it into our American psyche that meat is bad, and it's a hard thing to shake. And but it started back at the turn of the century. So he believed and taught that meat and dairy leads to aggression. Now this next part is I know it's a little racy, but I'm just telling you it's the history of it. And he taught that sexual stimulation, and by the way, this came from Ellen G. White's visions that she had, that sexual stimulation and the sinful behavior of self-gratification results from eating meat and dairy. So cereal was seen as an aphrodisiac. And that's why we have Battle Creek, Michigan. You know, Battle Creek, Michigan, that's where all the cereal companies are. Well, they all started there under the influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Lena Frances Cooper, she's the lady who started the very first American Dietetics Association. She was a protege of John Harvey Kellogg. She's Seventh-day Adventist. And the Seventh-day Adventist teachings on vegetarianism, as they began to spread, she saw an opportunity to take the teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist Church into the government. And the way she did that is that she was in the military, and because she was committed to the Seventh-day Adventist teaching on vegetarianism, she was able to get the approval to co-found the American Dietetic Association. So the very first American Dietetic Association, this is a picture of the graduating class, which she was a part of, it all sprung out of this religious dogma that meat is bad. So we just need to know that. And this allowed her to advocate for vegetarian national standards in dietetics. So this is where it all started. She influenced the government through the NIH, the National Institute of Health, with guidelines to include a plant-based diet, and her influence became less associated with religion in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and more associated with just accepted common knowledge. But we need to remember that neither Ellen G. White or John Harvey Kellogg or Reverend Graham or Lena Cooper based any of this on science. It was not based on science. It was based on religion. So this is where it got started, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, right here. None of it was based on science. Okay, so from there, we started replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils. And, your canola, your peanut, your safflower, your sunflower, your soybean, your sesame, it was a progression. And there are many other factors throughout history that played into this. Right now, the Harvard School of Public Health, Tufts University, the Mayo Clinic, and the American Heart Association all consider vegetable oil as heart healthy. So when I was raising a family and feeding my family, I thought, I need to use vegetable oil because it's heart healthy. And I do not need to cook with, lard. I need to get that out of the house. And we don't eat bacon anymore now. We eat turkey bacon. And we made all these changes. And Don, can I share your story?
Which one?
I should have asked him first. So, and my husband had a real big thing about fat. We're not supposed to eat fat. So the yogurt had to be no fat. The milk had to be skim. The bacon had to be turkey bacon. I better not ever, make real bacon. Can't have real bacon because it's too high in fat. And so we really were diligent with keeping animal fats out of our diet. Well, shortly after we moved here in 2006, my husband was diagnosed with a neuromuscular disorder called dystonia. And the medical profession will tell you that they don't know the cause of that, or they'll allude to you that it's probably genetic in nature. And my husband's not with me on this conclusion, but I think we may have done this by being so strict and so diligent to keep out all the saturated fat. Because your neuromuscular system is lined with cholesterol. It's the sheaths of nerves is made out of cholesterol and fat. So we're not just made out of protein, but we're also made out of fat. And we need to be eating fat and we need to be eating cholesterol. But one more thing about vegetable oils is that they're really not even vegetables. They're seeds. So a vegetable oil is a seed oil. And we need to talk about that just a little bit. But why did we start eating vegetable oils? It was a marketing campaign by Procter & Gamble. That's all it was. After World War II, they had been producing oil in order to lubricate the machinery that was necessary for the war. And whereas we ran out of whale oil because we were killing too many whales, so they put their technology into developing oil from seeds, and they started with cotton. And so cottonseed, it first was called cottonelle, but that became Crisco. And Crisco stands for crystallized cottonseed oil. And they were able, through a very, very sophisticated marketing campaign, to convince women to replace their hog fat. That's how they marketed traditional animal fat, whether it be lard or tallow or suet. They marketed as that hog fat. You need to get rid of that, and you need to join the new modern world and use Crisco. And so it was a very sophisticated marketing campaign, and they were very successful. So Procter & Gamble's did this, and then they also, from Crisco became, Crisco kind of took over, and then other vegetable oils kind of quickly followed. But these are industrial seed oils. They're not really vegetable oils, and it takes an awful lot to convert a seed into oil. So here are some images of the types of campaign. You can see on the top left-hand side, it says, you see the lid there, contains no hog fat. Can you read that? Some of the others, the one in the bottom there where she looks like she's holding her hand to her mouth, it says fry with the one and only Crisco. It's digestible. Like animal products and animal fats were not digestible. They're more digestible than the Crisco would have been. So they had to figure out a way to kind of tempt women to put away their animal fat and use vegetable oil, all for profit. Not for science, but all for profit. So they're really industrial seed oils, and I know there's an awful lot of information on this slide, but I'll break it down for us. Industrial seed oils, all those oils that I just showed you, they're really a slow poison, and they also are contributing, not just the cholesterol, the carbohydrates, the high level of highly processed foods and cholesterol carbohydrates that we're eating, but it's the seed oils that we're consuming. They're unnatural, they're not time-tested, they're modern, and they haven't been proven. There's no real science to demonstrate that they aren't going to harm us over a long period of time. One of the reasons that they're harmful for us is that they're very inflammatory. They're high in omega-6 and low in omega-3. And you want almost a 1-to-1 relationship between your 3s and your 6s. If anything, you could have a little bit higher 3, but you don't want, in today's standard, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is like 25-1 in favor of omega-6. So they're bad. They increase free radical activity and can cause damage to your DNA. Whereas saturated fat, okay, so that would be either your fruit oils or your animal fat like lard and tallow and butter and others, they are naturally found in nature. There's no factory required to make saturated fat. They're time tested for thousands of years. They're natural, they're non-industrial. They contain all the essential fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. Most of the food that you eat today, most of the food that y'all ate this morning for breakfast, did not have any fat-soluble vitamins. We don't get fat-soluble vitamins unless we eat meat or animal products, including dairy. And I think there's the alarming increase in obesity and heart disease and cancer, diabetes, and countless other illnesses are a result of eliminating them from our diet. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower had a heart attack. And at that time, men had not had a lot of heart attacks. If you can actually imagine a time when men did not have heart attacks and women did not have heart attacks. But in 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack and he was out of the Oval Office for about 2 weeks. And other middle-aged men were starting to have heart disease and were starting to have heart attacks and were starting to suffer from heart problems. And so it was a kind of a confluence of events. And without any science, good science, a man by the name of Ansel Keys came on the stage. He wanted to make a name for himself. He was a doctor. And he threw out the idea that saturated fat clogged the arteries and caused coronary heart disease. And it kind of seemed to make sense because, when you do an autopsy on somebody who's had a heart attack, you can go in and you can see a lot of cholesterol in the arteries, But what was really going on is we had an increase in sugar consumption by that time, and we had a lot of men smoking at a rate that we had never seen before in history. And so you combine smoking and nicotine and sugar, and you got heart issues and other issues. So this took place at just the wrong time in history. And Ansel Keys is kind of like the most infamous man in the keto community because he was so successful at demonizing saturated fat. And the study here, these two graphs at the bottom there, he's famous for his 7-country study, which allegedly demonstrated that, he could demonstrate that the countries who ate less saturated fat or animal products had lower cholesterol and were healthier than those who didn't. But the truth is he studied 22 countries, which is the graph on the right. But he lied because he couldn't get the results that he wanted. So he called it the 7-country study, not the 22-country study, because the first study did reinforce his bias. And it wasn't questioned. And, other series of events, the McGovern report came out and reiterated his findings. And then that's when we got our first food pyramid in the 1970s. And that's when we were told to greatly restrict animal products. So it's important to just know that there's history to this. There's a reason for it. We've abandoned the time-tested way of eating. This is not a new way of eating. Keto is not new. It's returning to the old way of eating. But we have lost our way. We've just lost our way. And so this last slide is just a little discussion about good science and bad science. U.S. News and World Report came out with a hit piece this last week on the keto diet. It was written by 2 dietitians. There were no studies referenced, and just about everything in the study could not be substantiated by science. But it was just more folklore. It was more kind of myths that we've just been believing about saturated fat and cholesterol and meat. And it's really unfortunate that just keeps happening. But part of it is because most doctors have been kind of propagandized by the medical community to teach this other way of eating. But we need to start thinking differently. Not only do we not just need to stick anything in our mouths before we read the ingredient list, we also need to know, okay, this is a study that says such and such. Now, who wrote this study? Who funded the study? What kind of a study was it? Was it a randomized control clinical trial, which is the gold standard? Okay, they're called RCTs. Go down to the bottom if you're online and look to see who the organization is. Is it an anti-meat organization? Which oftentimes I have found when I'm reading something I think is just an objective article on nutrition, I go down and I read that it's sponsored by some vegetarian organization. So you just have to be wise today. You have to know who the source is when you're reading online, especially. But the randomized controlled clinical trial is the gold standard. And there are so few of these in the nutritional world because you can't really, it's hard to test people over a long period of time and know what they're eating unless you go live in their house with them, right? So it's hard to do that. It's very expensive. And most of the times these RCTs are going to be funded by large corporations who have an objective in mind. They want to get a desired outcome. And so it's just hard to get reliable studies today. And we can be told, well, I don't know if I want to eat keto because I'm not sure it's safe long term, and there aren't really any studies that demonstrate that keto would be safe long term. I mean, you're not going to eat fruits long term. Well, you know what? The American Heart Association has a recommended diet called DASH, and there are no studies to demonstrate that it's sustainable and healthy. There are no studies. The American Dietetic Association has their recommended diet and the types of food that you should be consuming. But they don't have a controlled clinical trial that demonstrates that over a long period of time that's really a sustainable diet. So we don't want to just pick out one and not apply the same standard across the board. Usually the studies that are used are epidemiological studies, and these are studies that show correlation or association. They don't show cause and effect. And so that's also important, and we need to know that an epidemiological study is the type of study you normally get with nutrition, and it's based on questionnaires.